If I were to guess, you've probably seen this sign before. We'll work for food. God bless. Many of us have seen these signs as you drive down the road. And normally when we see these signs, we generally think, oh, that person, if you go get a job, then you can have food. Or don't sit on the side of the street and get a job and you'll be able to, have food and be able to eat. And too many times we have these misconceptions about the poor, and we evaluate them. What if I were to tell you there was once a movement that was focused on those people holding those signs, focusing on the poor, the people that weren't well off, and that it was focused based off the Bible? You probably think you were at church or you were listening to some crazy Christian talk about a new movement. But there was once a movement that was focused on just that swept Latin America between 1970 and 1984. And what I'm talking about is liberation theology. And that's what we're going to discuss today in this project. Over the next 10 minutes, I hope to give you just a brief understanding of how liberation theology came about, how it was put together, what the basic purpose were, what are base communities, how did these basic communities affect countries, and how did this theology affect country, and was it even effective? So hopefully we'll be able to get through that over the next few minutes. And also to do this, I'm going to use help from scholars to be able to tell you everything about liberation theology. I wouldn't be able to. So I'm going to use scholars' articles to help provide evidence and to tell us the story instead of me telling you the story. So to have a basic understanding, you got to know the background of what's going on in Latin America. This was kind of during the end of the populist regimes such as Perón in Argentina, Vargas in Brazil, and Cardenas in Mexico. And it left most of the third world undeveloped, and there was there was depression across the board. And for many countries, military regimes began to take over. It was really a time that was unstable. And to kind of quote this the whole scenario of what's going on can be quoted by Leonardo Boff, and he says this: the end of the 1960s with the crisis of populism and the developmentalist model brought the advent of vigorous current of sociological thinking, which unmasked the true causes of underdevelopment. Development and underdevelopment are two sides of the same coin. All of the nations of the Western world were engaged in a vast process of development. However, it was the interdependent and unequal organized in such a way that benefits flowed to the already developed countries of the center, and the disadvantaged were meted to the historically backward and undeveloped countries. The poverty of the world and I think this kind of sums it up. The poverty of the third world countries was the price to be paid for the first world to be able to enjoy the fruits of overabundance. And liberation kind of theology came about in 4 separate stages. And these stages were created in the beginning of 1970, late 1960s. And one person that I really need to mention is Gustavo Guerres. And he was behind this whole movement of liberation theology. And we're going to look at the first stage, and that's the foundational stage. And Boff, and this article comes from Leonardo Boff as well. And he says, the foundations were laid by those who sketched the general outlines of this way of doing theology, characterized by the presentation of liberation theology as sort of a fundamental theology, that is, an opening of new horizons and perspectives that gave a new outlook to whole theology. And there was tons and tons of different people across Latin America that helped in this stage. But next, we got to look at the building stage. And this was the second movement on the first efforts at giving liberation approach to doctoral content in 3 specific areas of the church. And they looked at Christology, spirituality, and eschatology. And these again were from Latin American writers and theologians and pastors all across Latin America. And then there was the settling in stage, and it was just to make a common language of everyone come together so that there weren't certain words over here and words over here. They just wanted to get a common ground, a common knowledge for everyone to understand. And what I think was very interesting that Boff mentions, that it was very popular for theologians to become priests during this time. And so I thought that was really neat because there was this need for priests, and we'll find that out just a little bit more as well. And then the final stage was the formulation stage. And that's what's everyone just coming together for one purpose. And out of this, we get Guares's Theology of Liberation, and it actually came out in 55 volumes according to Boff's article. Next, we're going to look at the basics. What are the basics of this movement? So they put all these things together. I understand that they came together and they used doctoral content. So what were the basis of this study? It interprets the Christian faith out of the suffering, struggle, and the hope of the poor. And again, this comes from Daniel Levine. All the basics come from him. And he says it's a critique of society and ideologies sustaining it. Pretends not to lay down specific rules for how to struggle for justice, but stresses the responsibility and the commitment with class conflict is an expression of love for one's neighbor. Through solidarity with the poor, theologians of liberation advocate the transcendence from class divisions to a new type of society. So basically, it critiques all angles of the poor. It's taking the biblical content and applying it to life, and they kind of focus it. Levine says they focus it off two parts of the Bible: the Exodus story and that liberation from coming to slave into the promised land, but also in Matthew, when Jesus talks about loving the poor and selling what you have and giving to one another. And that's where this kind of comes from. And he says this, in ontological terms, the impact of liberation theology is the clearest in its capacity to shape discourse, creating and promoting issues as legitimate topics of debate in society, political, and in the churches. So they didn't want this to be a church movement. They want this to be involved politically as well. Daniel Levine goes on to talk of, and this was one of the main purposes of liberation theology, one of the most effective tools were these CEBs. These were communities that were set up because there was a lack of pastors, and we're going to get into what they were exactly. Basically, they were seen as theories being put into practice according to Levine. And they were broken up into three words: escalbase, and that's just the right of the community. They have this special bond with one another that brings them together. And then there's also escale, and that was linking back to the church and to remember everything we're doing is from biblical principles. And then lastly, the community, just that it was small, and normally these were made up of 10 to 30 people. They met about once a week. They would spend time praying, reading the Bible, and what was really cool is they would give to one another according to Levine. They would give up their clothes for someone, they would give their money, and they would share with one another. But there was a problem. All of these things sound really good, but when people get together, a lot of times they look for power. And that's exactly what some of these did. According to Levine, he says that they would conflict with one another. Like one group in El Salvador or Brazil would not be closely related to Colombia. So they would begin clashing with one another to fight for their name because they had their names of these base community and they wanted more power. And that would be one of the negatives of these base communities. So we're going to look at the impact that it had in Brazil really quickly. And this comes from Roberto Jacobson, and he claims that liberation theology has made the greatest inroads in political life in Nicaragua. The successful Nicaraguan revolution has enabled the church to translate its theories into political action, both during and after its victories in Sandestia. And he claims that this liberation theology was one thing that fueled the revolution, and it helped bring it shined light on human right violations and also eliminated political oppositions that were corrupt. So they were showing the weaknesses in society and showing people that were getting hurt, and they were also intending to stop corruption politically as well. But there was one problem that started to rise that Michael Norvok speaks about. He said there was one fatal flaw in liberation theology. Was it all sound good during the revolution, but pretty much after the revolution, nothing really got done. And I quote, he says, "The worst mistake of liberation theology in Latin America is the fail to give adequate attention to the institutions of political economy to be built after the revolution. Too much romantic attention is given to Exodus and to the struggle of revolution." And in Nicaragua, liberation confronted for the first time the problems of the church identity after revolution. The dilemma has both political and religious components, meaning that after the revolution, there was no clear way to go. And the church was focused on its identity, but also trying to put this politically, and it just wasn't working out well. So you may be asking, I see there were some positives, there's some negatives. Was liberation theology overall a success? Because we can't get into every country and how it affected every country. I would like to wrap this up by quoting Anthony Gill on the whole topic of liberation theology and his perspective. And he says this: perhaps it's unfair to condemn liberation theology as a failed movement. While most scholars will admit that it did not live up to its promises, it may have been that expectations were set too high. Liberation theology and progressive grassroots Catholicism stimulated a serious debate about the cause and consequences of poverty in the third world, not only within a conservative hierarchy, but also within leftist circles. And that, so he says you can't really condemn it all. There were some good things, there were some bad things. And this is a very brief description of theology based on Wolfe, Levine, Jacobson, and Anthony Gill. And this is what they kind of bring to the table of liberation theology. And again, there's only so much that I'm able to give in these few moments. But this is their perspective on it. And I would also like to say I'm sorry for anything that I mispronunciate names, because I'm not fluent in Spanish. So thank you for your time, and I hope you enjoyed it.